Great, thank you. In many ways, unplanned, but a very good segue into what we are looking at this morning. So I wonder if we can just turn to Matthew chapter 8. We'll start at verse 1. Matthew chapter 8, starting at verse 1, and we're going to read to verse 13. Verse 1. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately he was cleansed from his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home, paralyzed, suffering terribly." Jesus said to him, "Shall I come and heal him?" The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. And I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed, and said to those following him, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from east and west, and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, let it be done just as you believed it would." And his servant was healed at that moment. How do we recognize good leaders? How do we assess whether a leader is competent, able to lead effectively? How do you know if a leader makes the cut? Whether they can back up their CV, whether they can deliver when it counts. It's often when they are tested, when their regime comes under the spotlight. And the test exposes the leader's character, and it happens in every organisation. It happens in businesses, schools, hospitals, sports teams. It happens in politics. President Zelensky of Ukraine has been put to the test, and he's shown the world his mettle. At a moment of testing, we discover, in light of all the commitments and promises of their manifesto, well, what is this leader really made of? We discover what will be the benefits of following this leader, and who might actually be the beneficiaries. And I'm sure it hasn't escaped anyone over the past year that this country has experienced an unprecedented amount of leadership shift. And with that, a good amount of leadership analysis. In the last year, there's been 4 chancellors of the Exchequer, 3 prime ministers, and 1 king later. And we're starting to understand what a king needs to do to pass the leadership test. We've had plenty of bad examples. A leader who can confirm themselves as competent. We're starting to understand what that is. Keeping that in mind, over the next 2 weeks, we'll be looking at what happened when Jesus, when he burst onto the scene of human history. The author of this eyewitness account of Jesus that we're reading is a disciple of Jesus who is committed to recording what Jesus has done, what he said. And he's determined that from what he saw, he would become one of Jesus' followers, to recognize Jesus as the leader he was. That is Matthew's gospel, has assembled a series of incidents to show us what took place as Jesus was put to the test as he commenced his ministry on earth. And these incidents don't just demonstrate the stuff that Jesus did, but also Jesus' character and the implications for those who follow him as a leader. And you'll notice we're starting in chapter 8. That means there has actually been a whole 7 chapters before this point in Matthew's account. And for context, in those chapters, Matthew, as the author, has already shown us how King Jesus was anticipated over centuries and millennia before he was born. That was in chapters 1 and 2. And Matthew has also shown us that in chapters 3 and 7 how Jesus has been announced as king, both through his works and his words. In those chapters we find Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount, a kingdom manifesto, if you like. And so we reach this point in chapter 8 with this long-expected Jesus arriving on the scene, having announced his manifesto to the world of his kingdom he is bringing, and naturally the testing begins. Is Jesus the leader we need? And Matthew wants to expel all doubt around that question, and so has assembled a series of cameo incidents, to convince his readers that the answer to that question, is Jesus the leader we need, is a resounding yes. And each one indicating the arrival of the king, and one by one building a picture of the kind of man Jesus is, and also what it might look like to submit to Jesus as king. And I'm sure if we slowed down and really looked at these verses, you'd find so many details contained in them. But even at our faster pace, just look at Jesus. Consider what he's done, who he is, and also learn what it might be to be one of his. Firstly, I want to look at the world into which Jesus has come, what he stepped down into, and then the work of the king, what it is Matthew tells us that Jesus is doing, and then finally the word of the king, what words accompany his actions. Firstly, the world. Jesus breaks into our broken world, and the incidents in verses 1 through 13 deal with death and disease. We're confronted with the unfortunate realities of our world, which we prefer to ignore. We just had a video of how that came to be. And verses 1 to 4, we've got this case of leprosy. Leprosy was one of the most awful and most feared diseases of the first century. Highly contagious, horribly disfiguring, socially isolating, and spiritually feared. Back in the Old Testament, when the sister of Moses, Miriam, when she was struck with leprosy, listen to what Moses said. Let us not be as one dead, whose flesh is half eaten away. When Naaman, the general of the ancient Syrian army, asked the king of Israel to have him healed of his leprosy, he replied, this is the king of Israel, "Am I God to kill and make alive?" There's only one person who can sort out leprosy. And additionally to all that, if leprosy wasn't bad enough, additionally under the Old Testament law, leprosy was used as this symbolic illustration of the spiritual consequences of all human sickness that entered our world as a result of our human rebellion against God. People just as you and me being afflicted ultimately with death, but also with disease prior to that because of our rebellion against our Creator God. So those with leprosy were considered unclean. They were socially maligned, and they were as good as dead. You see, humanity turning its back on God is humanity cut off from God. Humanity cut off from God is humanity under the judgment of God. Humanity under the judgment of God is humanity without life from God. And humanity without life from God is humanity perishing apart from God. And the leper in this picture is the reality that faces all of humanity. And so this individual here in verses 1 to 4 provides an illustration of this broken world in which we find ourselves. And it's into this world filled with death and in this case leprosy, it's against this backdrop that Jesus is announced as the king. And against this backdrop that Jesus promises he'll sort it out. It's no mean feat. And so the natural question is of Jesus, can he do that? And first century Israel is eerily familiar actually with the 21st century Britain. Leprosy doesn't threaten us, thankfully, but other diseases just as frightening and debilitating rage. And 2,000 years of human advancement, but some things remain unchanged. And death continues its 100% success rate. And admittedly, these are rather morbid things to be talking about on a Sunday morning rather. And I'm sure we could list off examples of how this world is broken, but I don't think we need to do that. I think we're all too familiar with how this world is broken. In fact, we're maybe even numb to it because it's our reality. And it begs the question, what kind of leader would be needed to undo our mess? Well, there comes a moment in every leader's experience when they are tested. And here is Jesus, stood here, and here is the ever-advancing, unstoppable tide of death, disease, and decay, humanity's greatest vice, standing up against Jesus the King. World versus King. And therefore we see what the work of the King is. These verses not only show us a vivid image of the world that Jesus enters, but also the work he's going to accomplish. He has come with absolute authority to roll back the effects of sin and death in the world. That's why he's come. But it's important to notice the verses and what they say about Jesus and his dealing with this. So verses 3 and 13. And we need to look at these, give them special attention to understand really what's at stake for humanity here. Verse 2, a man with leprosy came and knelt before Jesus and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And it's with this question, it's as though the very hope of humanity is in the balance at that moment. Can he? Will he? Here is this leper kneeling at his feet, begging him that he might do something about it. And we wait. And Jesus says, I will. Be clean. And immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. And think with me for a minute that if Jesus, God's long promised Christ, says, no, I'm sorry, I can't clean you of your leprosy, well, goes with it all hope for humanity. Death and disease win. Theirs is the final word. This leper and all of humanity as a result wait certain darkness, certain judgment. But Jesus, in 4 perfectly weighted words, confirms to the world that he is king, king with supreme authority. Look at his answer, I will be clean. Such compassion, confidence, self-assurance, authority. I don't know, if you can imagine yourself doing that on the hospital ward. It'd be rather embarrassing because nothing would happen. But Jesus said, I will be clean immediately. And again, thinking of this incident in the context of Matthew's Gospel, immediately after the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn in their sin, having sin and uncleanness so exposed through Jesus' manifesto. Here we have this picture of uncleanness and the judgment of God, and Jesus said, in response to this, if you are willing, can Jesus solve that? Can he do something about that? About sin, human sin and uncleanness? He says, I will be clean. Some medic in some research centre of some pharmacological institution makes some small shuffle forward, succeeding in some sphere of medical research, a tiny incremental development in curing, say, cancer. And it's all over the medical journals and the news outlets, and it's trumpeted as a triumph. And here is Jesus, standing on the shore alone in the face of the advancing tsunami of death and disease. Up till now, the unconquerable enemy. And what does Jesus say in its face? I will be clean immediately. So in part, these 2 incidents are meant to show us the arrival of the King with all his authority over death and disease. He is tested and he demonstrates his triumph. But I think there is more to these verses than that. Look at verses 4, 11 and 12. And to see that Jesus is the King whom the whole Old Testament testifies about. And whose work is to call men and women, regardless of their background, into this kingdom. So it's not just that there is a kingdom, it's not just that Jesus is the king of this kingdom, but that you and I can be part of this kingdom. Here is the work of the king. Verse 4. See that you don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift Moses commanded, as a testimony, a proof, if you like, to them. What is Jesus wanting this leper to prove? Proof of healing? Possibly. Proof of who Jesus is? Most likely. It seems from verse 4 that Jesus understands the whole Old Testament law, designed to set God's people apart from as his own, now testifies to the arrival of the rule of Jesus, who supersedes God's law, does what the law cannot. It seems which the Old Testament law identifies as the problem, death and disease. The Old Testament law now testifies or proves that Jesus is the solution. When a person was healed or cleansed of leprosy, which was incredibly rare, they had to go to the temple and they had to make a sacrifice to demonstrate they were back in the community. I guess today, think of the 10th day negative test during COVID. And Jesus says, you go to the leper, you go and present yourself at the temple. And now this whole law testifies that I have arrived, that I've stood up to death and disease. Now look at verses 11 and 12 as Jesus turns to the centurion. I say to you that many will come from east and west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So Jesus is claiming that he is not only the one whom the whole law testifies about, but also the one in whom God's great promise of salvation finds its fulfillment. So what is the work of the king? One, he has stepped down into our broken world, and then everything that God's law was unable to do and highlighted as the problem of this world, death and disease, Jesus is that solution. What is the work of the king? Number two, he has stepped down into our broken world, and as God has promised, he will draw together a kingdom of men and women from east and west, north and south, originating from every nation and every kingdom of man, who will benefit from his authority and power to defeat death and disease. And what is the work of the king? Number three, he has stepped down into our broken world, and where the Old Testament people of God reject him, he'll cast them out into darkness and call men and women from all the nations of the world to be part of his kingdom, where death and disease are gone to forever. It therefore makes what we are handling here extremely relevant to each one of us. Why? Because we're all facing death and disease. And Jesus in verse 3 shows he's the only one who's able to roll back the tide of death and disease. He's humanity's only hope. And so it really, really does matter how we respond to Jesus, what we make of him. He's given the evidence, he's been tried and tested, and where others failed, he succeeded. He has power and authority. He can roll back death. Death faces us all. No reminders needed of that. But there is a solution, and it's Jesus. Verse 11 is worth pausing on. I say to you that many will come from east and west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. What does this mean? What does it mean to take a place with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob? Who are Abraham, Isaac and Jacob? If we were to put Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in the pecking order of key figures in the biblical faith, where would they sit? To be sat with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, where would you be? Well, I guess they're the top individuals. They're in the state coach. They're on the top table. They're in the boardroom. They're on the balcony. Where would they be seated in Westminster Abbey last week? Well, they'd be on the front row. And do you see what Jesus is saying to this centurion? Many will come from east and west and take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and by implication, the leper before him. Jesus is come to establish this kingdom where death and disease are rolled back for all eternity. He comes into this broken world so scarred as a result of our human rebellion. And he turns to the leper, then to the centurion, and he opens the gates to his kingdom wide open. And I guess it also asks the question, what makes this centurion welcomed like this? Surely not his background, not his previous performance. This centurion, he's a Gentile, a rank outsider, perhaps a Roman, in which case he is unclean. He's not a Jew. But here's the word of the king. Verses 8 and 9. Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. And I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed, and said to those following, truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. So we look at the centurion, and by all accounts, he's a decent bloke, isn't he? Of course, in them days, there's no HR departments. Employees with possessions, not much has changed. Employees pretty much have the rights of life and death in those days. There's no employment law. There's no unions. There's no striking. But the centurion, he's a decent man. I've got this servant, and he's suffering terribly. He's a compassionate man. He's also a humble man. I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. On the outside, Jesus is just it doesn't look impressive. He's just an itinerant preacher going from place to place from an impoverished backwater. But here the centurion recognizes Jesus for who he is. And also the centurion, he's a logical man. Look at the logic he spells out. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes, and I say to that servant, do this, and he does it. In other words, the centurion says, I recognize that I speak with the emperor's authority, and when therefore I speak, people do as I tell them, because I am a man under authority, and because of the authority I'm under, so people do as I will tell them to do. And he's seen in Jesus one who is speaking with God's authority. He recognizes exactly who Jesus is. Where he can command troops and servants to do what he does, Jesus can command death and disease to go away, to be destroyed. And it seems for this centurion, all that qualifies this individual to be part of God's kingdom is that response, that he sees who Jesus is, that he comes to Jesus for help, and Jesus in his grace and his goodness responds to it and his request. See, membership of God's kingdom is constituted around a simple trust in the word of the king. He promises it. I guess the question for us is, will we receive it? And that means membership of this kingdom is therefore open to every single person in this room. Now, next week, we're going to look at a little bit more about the examples of what the king does, what he did on this earth, and also the realities of membership in his kingdom, and when we can actually expect for death and disease to be finally defeated in this world. Why don't I pray, and we'll finish there. Lord, we thank you that you have come into a world that is broken, that though you created it very good, as it says in Genesis, and as humans in our rebellion against you, we have messed that up, that you came. You came not to in the first place, judge us, to slap our wrist, to tell us how unworthy we are, even though we are, how much we deserve death and judgment, even though we do. Initially, you came to save us, to provide a plan of salvation. More than that, Lord, you came to defeat the very enemies that we faced, death and disease, all the things that we have brought into this world, Lord, that you came to defeat. And thank you, Lord, that you are the King that can do that. That this great vice of humanity is now on the ropes, that you've defeated it, and that we can look forward to a new creation as Christians where we won't die, where there won't be disease, there won't be unhappiness, Lord, in your kingdom, and we look forward to that. We just pray for those in the world who are not part of your kingdom, that they would receive you. They would recognize Jesus for who he is, the king of this world, the king of this universe, and also the king of them. And they would be brought into this kingdom, just like the leper, just like the centurion. So we pray for all this, and we thank you for your amazing word. Amen.